Hey everybody, and welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Battle of Edgehill, 1642, English Civil War Begins by Kings and Generals. This is technically episode 1 in their English Civil War series, though last time we did watch an introductory, I suppose, episode 0, about why the English Civil War began. In that video, we saw King Charles's struggles with trying to raise money without relying on the typical levers of taxation, which Parliament had withheld from him, and also the consternation over his close ties to Catholics, both his wife and in his government, which many of the English people and members of Parliament were not very fond of. So yeah, if you guys end up enjoying this reaction, I'd appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. And without any further ado, let's jump into this reaction.
In our last episode on the English Civil War, we discussed the many factors which gradually ramped up the tension between King Charles I of England and his parliament between the late 1620s and early 1630s.
Yep.
Discontent towards the monarch was growing among certain parties, but civil war still seemed absolutely unthinkable to the vast majority of English, who by
Yeah, I mean, we talked about how there was growing discontent with Charles's, say, tax policies, and people didn't like the creeping Catholicism of his administration as they saw it. But while there were some members of Parliament and nobles who were particularly upset about this and they resisted the tax policy and got put in prison, for most people it probably wasn't that big a deal. They generally liked the king and he wasn't doing too terribly. People weren't that upset. So from what we saw, there was some unrest, certainly, and there was some policy that people didn't like, but it wasn't too bad.
1637 had enjoyed nearly a half-century of peace. However, war was indeed on the horizon, and in this episode, we will explore the events which will escalate the situation beyond all hope of peace, starting with the Scottish Bishops' Wars, the Long Parliament, and the Battle of Edgehill. Your continued support allows us to expand our work, and we're so grateful for that. We're always eager to create more videos for you, and we think that you'll enjoy our documentaries on post-World War II history over on the Cold War channel.
Alright, I'll let this ad play out, because it's a relatively short one, but as I always say, make sure to show Kings and Generals some support. Go give them a like, subscribe to their channel. Here they're advertising their other channels, so we'll let this play through. So go and check out their Cold War channel. I haven't seen it. It looks fantastic. Wizards and Warriors, I enjoy those videos. Go and show them some support. A TikTok, there you go. Whatever you want, they've got it.
Subscribing to all three. The links are in the description.
I'm doing my own ad for them.
And pinned comment. Thanks for being with us. Throughout the latter part of his personal rule,
Hey, there we go. You see the little note on screen about how the 1600s are the century of absolutism. Exactly what I was talking about last time. We were talking about, in the last video, which you should watch if you haven't seen, about how Charles was attempting to introduce absolutism to England, and, he failed in the end, but there were far more successful examples on the continent, like Louis XIV. He was sort of the typical absolute monarch. He is the best example of that style of ruling.
Opposition began to mount increasingly against King Charles I. However, this opposition could not be channeled into any meaningful change due to the irregular and infrequent intervals in which Parliament convened. Nevertheless, this state of affairs would soon change due to growing unrest to the north in Scotland, where the meddling of one Archbishop Laud was about to trigger a war. Scotland's decentralized and radically Protestant church, known as the Presbyterian Church, had deeply ingrained roots in the country's lowlands and parts of the Highlands.
Yeah, we're getting into Scotland's religious divide with the Church of Scotland, or as we call it in Scotland, some people the Kirk. That's another word for church. I'm excited to get into some Scottish history because if y'all don't know, I I am, in fact, Scottish. I was born there and raised for a couple years, though I live in the United States now, so it's always good to get some Scottish history on the channel.
The Scots held on to their native faith lovingly, so when Charles and his administration tried to impose the Anglican Book of Common Prayer on them by royal decree, England's northern neighbour began to implode.
Well, it is worth noting, I mean, the Church of Scotland was very prominent at this point, but there was a notable Catholic population, particularly in some parts of the Highlands.
Nationalist sentiment was stoked among all the classes, all the way from leading Scottish nobles down to the servant girls, one of whom notoriously threw a stool at the minister in St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh when he attempted to read from the Anglican book. An organised response came on February 29, 1638, when Scottish lords signed the National Covenant, a pledge to uphold the native Scottish religion at all costs. This covenant pledged loyalty to the king, but on the condition that the Presbyterian Church was maintained in its unmolested form. This covenant circled...
And this is once again showing us the importance of religion at this time, perhaps over any other form of identity. It's interesting to look at this because at this point in the early 17th century, like most places around the world, Scotland does not have a very strongly developed national identity. Nationalism would really begin to spread in the late 1700s, early 1800s, but what it does have is a very strong religious identity, and in a way, that is sort of its national identity. And so we can see how motivated the people are of every class by their religion, how that is perhaps the number one most important thing in their life, and how that religiosity, that is what it means to be Scottish. I mean, that is intrinsically tied with that national identity in a way that it would not be a few hundred years later, for example.
Circled around Scotland and gained rapturous support on all fronts, with its adherents becoming known as Covenanters. Over the next year, attempts at a negotiated solution failed, and war became inevitable. As a result, both sides began to raise their armies, the highly motivated Scots more quickly than the English, many of whom were actually sympathetic to the Scottish cause. Critically, this war footing began to push Charles's finances to the breaking point. To further compound matters, many of his aristocratic financiers were Catholic.
Yep, as we've seen many times throughout history, raising funds for a war or fighting a war and already having raised the funds can cause a lot of unrest and can perhaps lead to civil war or revolution. I mean, if we look at the American Revolution, that was caused in part by the taxes levied following the 7 Years' War. The French Revolution was partially caused by, the French royal administration spending so much money aiding the American rebels. So, if you're a monarch, be careful fighting any extra unnecessary wars that you can't afford to fight, because people will start to get antsy.
The First Bishops' War of 1639 was short and inconclusive, ending with the pacification of Berwick, which both sides realized would not put an end to the conflict. So, both the Scots and the English began preparing for its resumption. However, Charles's war chest had run dry, and with all his sources of finance dried up, he was forced on April 13th to summon what would become known as the Short Parliament, the first in 11 years. However, after just 3 weeks of subsequent stalemate and frustration on both sides, the king dissolved Parliament again on May 5th, 1639. Charles then immediately resumed collection of the hated ship money in order to fund his war. The Second Bishops' War of 1640 was a complete disaster for the king. A Scottish army of 20,000 Covenanters, led by the highly competent Earl of Leven, managed to outmaneuver the English, and not long after, defeated them at the Battle of Newburn.
Wow.
Following what was the first Scottish victory on English soil since 1388,
Whoa.
Leven occupied northeastern England. As a note, the Earl of Leven, also known as Alexander Leslie, had spent the previous decade fighting in the 30 Years' War in the service of Sweden's Gustavus Adolphus.
Okay, well, that shows where he got some of his experience from. As we talked about last time, the 30 Years' War was a religious war in continental Europe, primarily in Germany, or the German states, the Holy Roman Empire. It was extremely destructive, and Gustavus Adolphus is sort of one of the Protestant heroes of the conflict. He was a brave and talented leader, and so serving under him would probably get you some important experience, some very useful experience.
We've previously covered his contribution to the Siege of Stralsund. To end this disastrous conflict, Charles signed the Treaty of Ripon, the terms of which required that the king pay the Scots £850 per day to maintain their occupation. Now burdened by this new financial drain, in addition to his own army, Charles was once again forced to call a parliament. Holding its first session on November 3rd, 1640, this would become known as the Long Parliament, because it would not be formally dissolved until March 1660. This time, Parliament was almost totally united against the king, and its more radical Puritan elements, led by the Earl of Warwick, began to dominate affairs. His radical allies tried and executed the Earl of Strafford, Charles's chief minister, began lengthy legal proceedings against Archbishop Laud, and secured other unprecedented concessions from the crown. All of these demands and more were set out in the Grand Remonstrance, a document of grievances and conditions, the most crucial of which would have deprived the king of many traditionally royal rights and...
It's interesting how oppositional the parliament is being. You can clearly see that Charles is facing a lot of opposition in his attempt to rule absolutely, and is really failing in that front. I guess the comparison doesn't make much sense, but I think of someone like Louis XIV and how absolutely, fittingly, he was able to dominate his nobility, his aristocracy. He had them under his thumb. And you look at Charles, and you've got a, very hostile parliament, beginning to be run by radicals, religious radicals, but, at the time that also meant you were a political radical. They're executing his ministers, they're telling him no directly, they're not giving him at all what he wants. So it's very interesting how opposed they were, and openly opposed. And also to touch on something I also said there, we're talking about radicals. These are religious radicals, right? But because of how important religion was at the time, which I've stated several times before, being a religious radical meant you were also a political radical. It was all tied up. Religion was, perhaps the most important thing a lot of these people had in mind. We talked about it in the last episode of this series. The two grievances people had with Charles was taxes and religion. And so, we can really see the importance of religion here. The political radicals, they were Puritan religious radicals.
Privileges. It didn't seem that Charles was going to accept any further restriction of his power anyway, but an external factor now intervened and made everything that much worse. In October, the month before the king had summoned the Long Parliament, a Catholic revolt had erupted in Ireland.
Uh-oh.
Thousands of Protestants were already dead, and many more were refugees. It was clear that an army would be necessary to quell the Irish. But under whose authority could the army be raised? Parliament no longer trusted the king with military force, fearing that he would use the army against them, while the king would not accept Parliament's control because of the same reason.
So you can see how tense the situation has gotten, where neither the king nor the parliament trust the other to raise an army, which they need to raise in order to put down a revolt in Ireland, which, is basically a colony at this point. Ireland is very mistreated, at this point and for hundreds of years to follow. It's pretty despicable the way Ireland is treated by Britain. But anyway, from their perspective, they need to put down this revolt, but neither could trust the other to raise a military. That is a dangerous and tense position to be in.
For some reason, perhaps because Charles had uncovered evidence that his enemies in Parliament had been conspiring with the Covenanters, Charles marched to the House of Commons with 400 soldiers on January 5th, 1642. There, he attempted to arrest 5 MPs, John Pym, John Hampden, Arthur Hazelrig, Denzil Halls, and William Strode, the ostensible ringleaders of this imagined Covenanter conspiracy. When this attempt embarrassingly failed, the royal family quickly left London.
Okay, how exactly did it fail? I wish they would have specified that. Maybe some of you guys know. I feel like it shouldn't be that hard to lead a bunch of troops in and arrest some members of Parliament. What went wrong? How did the attempt fail?
And went to Windsor Castle, fearing that the Parliament-supporting London mobs would be riled into a fury against them.
Ooh.
From this point forward, King Charles and his opponents at Westminster edged slowly closer to civil war, with each side unwilling to blink, and both sides hoping that the other would do so first. Charles was able to convince many of his English and Welsh subjects that he stood for the defence of their traditional constitution and Elizabethan church doctrine, while Parliament argued that the king ought to be deprived of his remaining constitutional powers, as it was clear that he could not be trusted to use them.
Yeah, well, I think the build-up is kind of famous for the obstinacy of both sides, but in particular Charles. I think Charles was known for being very uncompromising, and he was on this mission to become an absolute monarch. I mean, he already viewed himself as an absolute monarch. He was empowered by God to make whatever decisions he wanted to make. So that probably explains why he was not willing to make any concessions. And it would screw him over in the end, of course. He'd lose his life over it. But yeah, he just was not willing to compromise. He really saw no reason to compromise. I mean, it wouldn't have been right in his perspective. Though, of course, Parliament was also increasingly radical, and they wanted to get their own way.
This too attracted many supporters, as did the widespread Puritan desire in Parliament to undertake radical religious reform. In the end, both sides attracted enough support to take the final step towards civil war. By early 1642, Charles had moved his court north to the city of York. Attempting to seize control of the situation in Ireland and assume military authority of their own, Parliament unconstitutionally issued the Militia Ordinance in March 1642, permitting them to raise an army and appoint its commanders. They chose the staunch anti-royalist Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, whose father had been executed after an attempted coup against Elizabeth I. Now requiring an army of his own to counter that of his enemies at Westminster, Charles passed the equally unconstitutional Commission of Array, allowing the king's chosen commissioners, usually local nobles, to levy troops from their own regions for service in the royal army.
You know, it is funny how both sides try to present themselves as the defenders of the traditional constitution, traditional liberties, but when it comes down to it, they're both like, well, we can put that aside. We need to raise some troops. So, I mean, you can sort of see what is political bluster and what is real principle.
As the twin armies slowly began to grow, Charles marched from his base at York to the armory city of Hull, arriving outside its gates on April 29th. The city contained a vast amount of arms and ammunition, enough to supply the Royalist army's coming campaign if it became necessary. As it turned out, Charles was out of luck. Hull's governor, Sir John Hotham, had flipped to the parliamentary cause and barred the gates to the king, forcing His Majesty to retreat in humiliation, eventually ending up in Nottingham. It was there that on August 22nd, 1642, the king officially raised his royal standard on Castle Hill. In what was thought by many to be an ill omen for the coming clash, a storm blew the banner down the following night. The campaign began slowly. On September 9th, Parliament's appointed commander, Essex, established a headquarters at Northampton.
You know, it is interesting how, in a way, this is sort of a monarch versus his nobility, although I know some nobles sided with Charles and the royalist side, but it's a monarch versus his nobles, which is, we've seen plenty of times before, but it kind of takes on a different character due to the institution of Parliament. It becomes the monarch versus his Parliament, and that sort of frames things a little differently, and I think makes us see the conflict differently, ascribe different values to the parliamentarian side than we would if it was just a simple nobility versus monarch conflict. Though, of course, it is different because the institution of Parliament exists. I think it's just a sort of interesting shift in the framing of the situation.
With the aim of intercepting Charles's army with his own, and preventing any royalist march on London. The king, meanwhile, was still in a bit of a shaky situation. With only 5 regiments of foot and 500 cavalry troopers by this time, the king's army needed more men. In order to get them, Charles departed from Nottingham September 13th and marched west through Derby, Uttoxeter, Stafford and Wellington, eventually reaching Shrewsbury on the 20th. This position allowed the Royalists to absorb more units Charles's commissioners had raised in North Wales and Lancashire, swelling his army to a workable size. While this was happening, the Royalist horse, under the experienced command of Prince Rupert, took up position in Bridgnorth, aiming to screen any potential parliamentary attack on the main army. Prince Rupert was the son of Frederick V, Elector of the Palatinate, who had failed to gain the throne of Bohemia in 1618, essentially beginning the 30 Years' War. After being captured by the Holy Roman Empire in a military campaign, Rupert had been freed by the diplomatic maneuvering of his uncle, Charles I. He subsequently came over to England and gratefully joined the English king's army as an extremely competent cavalry commander.
Once again, we're getting some tie-ins to the 30 Years' War, and even though England was not that involved, partially due to the rule of Charles, who didn't really want to get that involved, the conflict still has a lot of influence on what's going on back in England, in a political sense, in a practical sense, with all these individuals who fought in the 30 Years' War now have come back to fight in England. And also, of course, this is another sort of religious conflict. I suppose there's a lot we could point out in common between the two. Maybe England was just itching for a fight. They hadn't taken part in the 30 Years' War. The rest of Europe had been tearing itself apart. England was like, you know what, let's do a civil war. We need to get some fighting in as well. We need some bloodshed. Obviously not, but,
Essex subsequently attempted to prevent a royalist thrust towards London and deter further royalist reinforcements by marching towards Worcester. While the bulk of Parliament's field army was ponderously making its way through the scattered villages of the Midlands, Essex sent 2 cavalry regiments ahead to secure the west bank of the River Severn. However, when around 1,000 parliamentary horsemen ran into a similar number of Prince Rupert's royalist horsemen at Powick Bridge, the former were quickly routed and driven off by Robert's superior tactics. This was the first true engagement of the Civil War, and was, according to parliamentarian Hugh Peters, where England's sorrows began. Buoyed by this initial victory, the now enlarged royalist army began to move out of Shrewsbury on October 12th, with London as its ultimate objective. Charles would march on the Viper's Nest and end the war here and now.
All right.
A week later, Essex began his eastward march in pursuit, eventually arriving in the vicinity of Kyneton with the aim of protecting Banbury, while Charles and his army were conducting operations from the nearby town of Edgehill. Because of the two sides' inexperience in war, insufficient scouting had not alerted either side to the presence of the other so close by.
Wow.
A royalist council of war at Edgehill, held on the 22nd, decided that a 4,000-strong brigade would attempt to seize Banbury the next day. By nightfall, the King's army was dispersing into billets around the Wormington Hills, while at the same time, Essex's army finally arrived at Kyneton. While Charles was staying at the home of Sir William Chansey, Prince Rupert rode to Wormleighton, and seemingly by chance, managed to capture a quartermaster's party from Essex's army, which was nearby. After prying information from the prisoners, Rupert sent a few mounted scouts to Kyneton, who returned at midnight and confirmed that the entire parliamentary army was right there.
So, the only intelligence they actually receive is basically gained through pure chance, pure luck. Neither side is scouting to the best of their ability, I suppose. They are right next to each other, and the Royalists only realized that because they got lucky enough to capture some parliamentarian troops. How about that?
By 3 a.m. on the 23rd of October, Charles was aware that Essex was in the area, and an hour later, exhausted officers began to dispatch orders to their men for a general rendezvous near the Edgehill Heights. At this point, the King's Royalist army was between Essex and London, meaning that it could have marched towards London relatively unopposed. However, Charles and his advisors would not back away from the clash, and decided to do a...
What do you guys think? Would it have been the correct move to march on London? That was the ultimate objective. I suppose they felt like they couldn't just let this parliamentarian army go. It was right here. They had to face it now. But would Charles have been more successful if he would have just marched on London? I suppose then he would have had to play defense. I'm not sure how defensible London actually is. Seems like... Well, I guess it depends on how this battle goes. Everything's in retrospect, right? If this... And I don't know how this is going to go. If this goes well for Charles, then you'd say, well, good thing he fought the parliamentarians here. If it goes badly, then you'd say he should have just headed to London. I'm not sure, but then again, I don't know much about this conflict overall, so I'm curious what you guys think. Should he have just headed straight for London? Would he have been better off that way?
180, finally meeting the Roundhead army near Edgehill, 3 miles southeast of Kyneton. By the afternoon of October 23rd, the armies of Parliament and King now faced each other across a section of arable land and meadow just northwest of the main slopes. To all those present on both sides, it seemed as though the decisive battle of the war was at hand.
Yeah, I'm sure it did. Both sides have gathered their forces. They've met relatively quickly. I'm sure everybody there probably thought, all right, we're going to scrap it out here. It's going to be over. And that's it. The English Civil War will be done. Whoever wins here has won the war. Little did they know, they would have to wait a few more years for everything to be over. Quite a few more years, actually.
With its battle array formed on the level ground just in front of Radway, Charles I's Royalists arrayed their army in 2 lines of battle, opting to deploy in the Swedish-style checkerboard formation rather than in the Dutch style, which would allow the second-line regiments to form a continuous front if needed. Infantry brigades in the first line, from left to right, were led by Henry Wentworth, Richard Fielding, and Charles Gerard, while those to the rear were led by Sir Nicholas Byron and John Bellasis. All appear to have been about the same size, for a total infantry force of just over 9,000 men.
All right.
Opposite them were Essex's infantry, formed up into 3 large but loosely formed brigades of roughly 4,000 men each, for a total of 12,000 foot. The central brigade...
Okay, so we've got more parliamentarian infantry than royalists. They are outnumbered. In terms of numbers, we're dealing with sort of a mid-sized force, I would say. I'm not sure what the size of armies around this period were. I know if we're talking about late antiquity, they were quite small, but we are in 1642. I imagine the size of armies is probably growing, particularly with the 30 Years' War. I know there was a lot of men participating in that. So this is maybe a mid-sized force for the time? I'm not sure.
Brigade took up a mainly defensive position behind a small hill, while the 2 on the flanks were slightly in front. Most of the cavalry on both sides of the battlefield was present on Prince Rupert's Royalist right wing. He held overall command on this flank, had a unit of 1,000 dragoons, and was opposed by James Ramsay's parliamentary cavalry. Also on this side of the battlefield was a unit of parliamentary dragoon mobile infantry and musketeers hidden to ambush in a nearby hedgerow.
Smart.
On the other flank, slightly less numerous Royalist cavalry under Henry Wilmot faced those commanded by the Duke of Bedford. It's said that King Charles visited every unit of his cavalry and all of his infantry formations in order to review his troops and encourage them for the coming battle.
I think Charles was a pretty hands-on guy. You know, he wanted to be in control of what was happening. I mean, the whole issue that started this was his absolutism, so I'm not too surprised that he would want to go around personally and inspect every unit, make sure everything was up to scratch.
He even wished to ride with his army, but was persuaded to retire to the rear with his small lifeguard cavalry reserve.
I mean, that would have been pretty inspiring, your king riding out there with you. I'm sure that would have been a massive boost of motivation to everybody there. Of course, at the same time, that risks him just being killed in the first battle of the conflict, and then it's all over. You know, your whole rallying cry is to put the king back in power. If your king is dead, then everything's going to fall apart.
The majority of which had persuaded the king to let them join Rupert's charge. The first major battle of the English Civil War finally began at 2 p.m. with an artillery duel. Lasting for 1 hour, neither bombardment inflicted heavy losses and served more as a loud prelude to the real battle.
Yeah, artillery would advance a lot over the next 100, 200 years. It would become far more effective, say, in the time of Napoleon, and Napoleon was a big part of that, but at this point, it still wasn't too dynamic.
While this was going on, dragoons on Rupert's extreme right wing were able to discover and eventually repel the Roundhead ambushers within the hedgerow, providing the main cavalry force with a free run at the enemy. With Essex's army unwilling to move first, fighting began when both of the Royalist cavalry wings launched a thunderous head-on charge at their opposition. Using the latest cavalry shock tactics of direct charge imported from the continent by Prince Rupert, the King's horsemen on both flanks swept away Parliament's cavalry, which still used stationary Dutch tactics of firing from saddleback.
Wow. I mean, maybe it's not worth reiterating, as I've said it before, but I like that they're showing us how the 30 Years' War, in this case particularly the tactics and strategies developed during the 30 Years' War, are influencing warfare back in England. Rupert is bringing a lot of this new strategy that he learned fighting under Gustavus Adolphus back to Britain, and he appears to be using it quite effectively, whereas, at least at this point, the parliamentarians are relying on old, as they refer to them, Dutch tactics. I'm not sure what the significance of that is, why they're using Dutch tactics. Maybe they were just the status quo prior to the 30 Years' War. But at the moment, the Royalists are sort of getting the upper hand.
A unit of parliamentarian troopers even deserted and joined the Royalists.
Wow. I mean, that's got to be an elevated risk during a civil war. That's sort of interesting to think about. During most wars, if you've got, say, one country versus another, the risk of a unit from one army joining the other army is probably fairly low, but during a civil war, maybe if the battle's going badly enough, you say, you know what, let's just join the other side. We're all English here, right? Or maybe you genuinely do feel differently. You've come into battle against the king, and this unit saying, you know what, this just isn't right. We have to go join the Royalists. I'm sure a combination of the two, but that definitely has to be a risk.
With both of Essex's mounted wings swept off the field, it seemed like the time was right for the King's horse to pivot and launch the coup de grace against Parliament's flank and rear.
Yeah.
However, due to the indiscipline of its commanders and individual soldiers, who were flushed with the glory of victory, they instead continued chasing the routed enemy.
See, this is what happens when you find success in your first battle. If all these troops had fought in the 30 Years' War, they probably would have had enough experience to think, you know what, let's turn around and flank the main infantry. That probably would have been the right thing to do. I mean, imagine the Royalist cavalry is driven away. The opposing cavalry, now they swing back around and just absolutely crush the center of the parliamentarian army. I mean, it really could have been over right here and right now. But instead, for a lot of them, this is their first battle. The victory's going to their head. They're flush with success, and they just keep chasing the enemy cavalry. Not good at all.
Historians believe that if the Royalist cavalry had halted, regrouped, and charged at this point, the English Civil War could have been put to a decisive end. But it was not to be, and the opportunity was lost. With almost all horsemen now off the field, both infantry forces filed into a single line of battle and...
It's funny, the Royalists just had a big W against the Parliamentarian cavalry. They smashed through them, sent them running. That should be a massive advantage. But we've ended up here, where almost all cavalry on both sides is off the field, so it's almost as if it didn't really matter, or it didn't even happen. Of course, I'm sure the morale of the Royalists has been boosted, but apart from that, we're back to just infantry on infantry. Nothing has really changed.
And prepared to advance. Musketeers blasted away and softened up the opposing foot, before the pikemen, wielding their 16-foot-long weapons, came into contact and engaged in a so-called push of pike, a shoving match during which the two sides literally pushed each other until one broke.
Jeez.
Better equipped parliamentary footmen managed to gain a slight advantage, and casualties slowly began to mount on both sides. Now that all of the Royalist cavalry had victoriously left the field, two Parliamentary Reserve cavalry units under Sir William Balfour and Philip Stapleton, which had previously been hidden behind a small hill, struck the flanks of Byron's unit.
Not good at all. If the Royalists had kept some cavalry around, even if they hadn't managed a successful flanking maneuver on the Parliamentarian infantry, at least they would have been here to defend against this sort of sneaky Parliamentarian cavalry charge.
After subsequently bursting through the Royalist centre, Balfour managed to disable a few of the enemy's artillery pieces. Without knowing it, they had also come extremely close to capturing the King's sons, Charles and his brother James. In the midst of the fighting, the King's royal standard was seized by the Parliamentary infantry, but was then recaptured by a Royalist cavalry officer. By late afternoon, inexperienced soldiers on both sides were shaken by the experience of battle, and by dusk, Rupert's cavalry returned and stabilized the situation.
Here we go.
Neither side had any further stomach for the battle, and both backed off at nightfall.
Wow.
By the time morning came, the Royalists had retreated from the field, and the battle ended as a stalemate.
Stalemate, though some promising signs for the Royalists. At the beginning, they absolutely had the upper hand when they won that cavalry skirmish, and they had a couple opportunities to really destroy their enemy, though they didn't. And of course, then the Parliamentarians had their little cavalry charge later in the battle. So overall, fairly even, though I think the Royalists may have performed a little better.
The 1,500 dead soldiers was a small casualty count when compared to the horrors on the continent, primarily due to the terribly cold night which followed the battle at Edgehill, which helped to seal the fate of many injured troops.
Jeez.
Contrary to the expectations of many present, however, Edgehill was not decisive, and the English Civil War would continue into 1643. Our series on the battle between King Charles and his rebellious parliament will continue, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely.
Alright, make sure to do that. Go give Kings and Generals a like, subscription, all that stuff. And while you're at it, I would very much appreciate if you left a like on this video, subscribe to the channel, and checked out my Patreon, which is linked down below. I had a good time with this one. I'm very excited for the series to continue. I hope we get more of the political wrangling of the English Civil War, which I find particularly interesting. I'm not really a military historian, not at all, actually. I'm more interested in political history, plus the history of ideas and ideology. But in this case, I think the politics of the situation, the rule of Cromwell, a lot of that stuff is really fascinating. We get a lot of early English radicalism, which will come to really influence the whole Anglophone world Britain and prominently America. But yeah, this was a good one. It was an interesting first battle. Ended up being basically a stalemate, but I'm excited to see where the series goes from now. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.